Welcome to the Deep Dive, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at some potential changes to the Department of Justice.
All right.
You've shared a chapter with us called Department of Justice,
Right.
and it's part of a larger document called Mandate for Leadership, The Conservative Promise.
Okay.
It's written by Gene Hamilton, and it really paints a picture of a very, very different DOJ.
Yeah,
So are you ready to explore what these proposed reforms could mean?
absolutely. This chapter, it doesn't hold back. It starts by arguing that the DOJ has, like, veered off course.
Yeah.
And as a result, public trust has taken a serious hit.
Yeah, and they back that up with a pretty startling statistic, right?
Yeah.
They say that nearly half of Americans see the DOJ as, and I'm quoting here, too political, corrupt, and not to be trusted.
Wow.
But they don't just throw that out there. They point to specific examples of DOJ actions that have contributed to this perception.
Right.
What are some of the key events they highlight?
Well, they bring up a number of high-profile cases and decisions, like the FBI's investigation into the alleged Russian collusion
Yeah,
and the way the Hunter Biden laptop story was handled.
right.
They also criticize how the DOJ reacted to parents voicing concerns at school board meetings,
Sorry.
particularly compared to its response to attacks on pregnancy care centers.
So there's this sense that the DOJ is applying the law unevenly,
Yeah.
potentially targeting certain groups while giving others a pass. Is that what they're getting at?
Exactly. The chapter suggests that these examples and others like them reveal a deeper issue,
Okay.
a bloated bureaucracy within the DOJ that's become fixated on a radical liberal agenda.
Mm-hmm.
In their view, this has led the department away from its core mission
Yeah.
of protecting public safety and upholding the rule of law.
Okay, so they've laid out the problems as they see them.
Yeah.
But what's the solution? How do they propose to actually fix the DOJ?
Well, the chapter provides a very detailed roadmap for reform,
Okay.
with proposals that range from, completely overhauling the FBI to rethinking the department's approach to immigration enforcement.
Whoa, that's a pretty wide scope. It sounds like they want to shake things up from top to bottom.
Yeah, they definitely want to see significant changes.
Okay.
One of their key arguments is that the DOJ needs to refocus on its fundamental responsibilities.
Right.
This means prioritizing public safety above all else,
Mm-hmm.
which they argue has taken a back seat to more politically driven initiatives.
Okay. And how do they propose to make that happen? What are some of the concrete actions they recommend?
Well, they lay out 4 key areas of action.
Okay.
First, they want to see a complete overhaul of the FBI,
Mm.
aiming to restore its integrity and effectiveness.
Okay.
Second, they call for a renewed emphasis on tackling violent crime,
Yeah.
particularly in jurisdictions where they see local authorities failing to uphold the rule of law.
Right.
Third, they want to strengthen the DOJ's tools for dismantling criminal enterprises,
Okay.
both domestic and international.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, they advocate for a national security agenda that prioritizes external threats and protects the rights of American citizens.
Let's dig into that first one. Reforming the FBI sounds like a massive undertaking. What are some of the specific changes they have in mind?
Well, they propose a sweeping review of all active FBI investigations, which would be a huge endeavor in itself.
Yeah.
They also want to restructure the FBI's position within the DOJ,
Okay.
potentially removing it from the direct supervision of the Deputy Attorney General
Okay.
and placing it under the Assistant Attorney General
Mm-hmm.
for either the Criminal or National Security Division.
Right.
This would create a clearer line of authority and accountability.
Interesting. So it's not just about changing policies. It's about shifting the power dynamics within the department itself. But they go even further than that, right?
Yeah.
I understand they have some pretty strong opinions about the FBI's role in combating what they call misinformation and disinformation.
Yes, that's a key part of their critique. The chapter argues that the FBI shouldn't be involved in policing speech, whether it's online or in traditional media.
So they're basically saying that the government has no business deciding what's true or false,
Right.
and that people should be free to express their opinions.
Yes,
Even if those opinions are unpopular or controversial.
precisely. They argue that this role is better left to the private sector and civil society,
Mm-hmm.
where there can be more open debate and scrutiny.
That's a pretty significant departure from the way things are currently done. What else is on their list of FBI reforms?
Well, they also want to streamline non-law enforcement functions within the FBI,
Okay.
potentially shifting legal counsel responsibilities to the DOJ.
All right.
They argue that this would allow the FBI to focus more on its core investigative work.
Yeah.
In addition, they propose shifting resources and personnel from headquarters to field offices,
Okay.
emphasizing a more decentralized approach with a greater focus on local needs and priorities.
So less bureaucracy, more boots on the ground. That seems to be a recurring theme here.
It definitely is.
Yeah.
And perhaps their most controversial proposal is to eliminate the 10-year term limit for the FBI director.
Wow, that's a big one.
They argue that this limit restricts the president's ability to appoint a director who fully aligns with their agenda and vision for the department.
That's a big change. It makes the director much more directly accountable to the president, but it also raises questions, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Could this potentially lead to more political influence over the FBI? How do they address that concern?
They argue that true accountability lies with the president,
Okay.
who is ultimately responsible for the actions of the executive branch. They believe that a director who serves at the pleasure of the president would be more responsive to the administration's priorities
Yeah.
and more likely to carry out its directives.
So they're basically saying that the benefits of increased accountability outweigh the potential risks of politicization.
That's their argument.
Okay.
They believe that a more aligned and responsive FBI under the direct control of the president would be better equipped to address the challenges facing the nation.
Okay, we've talked a lot about the FBI, but that's just one piece of the puzzle.
Right.
They also want to see a major shift in how the DOJ approaches violent crime.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that for us?
Absolutely. The chapter really emphasizes the need to prioritize reducing violent crime, which they argue has been neglected in recent years. They're critical of what they call the criminal justice reform movement, claiming that it's led to a surge in crime rates.
Right.
They point to the rise in violent crime as evidence that the current approach isn't working.
They seem to be drawing a sharp contrast between that and the DOJ's focus on things like threats made at school board meetings.
Exactly. They see that as a misallocation of resources, especially when compared to the lack of attention given to attacks on pregnancy care centers.
Yeah.
They argue that the DOJ needs to get its priorities straight and focus on the crimes that are causing the most harm to communities.
So it's about aligning the DOJ's efforts with the realities on the ground.
Yeah.
Making sure they're tackling the issues that are having the biggest impact on people's lives.
That's the idea.
Okay.
They believe that the DOJ should be a force for restoring order and safety,
Yeah.
particularly in communities that are struggling with high crime rates.
And how do they propose to make that happen? What are some of their specific recommendations for addressing violent crime?
Well, they advocate for a more assertive federal role,
Okay.
particularly in areas they identify as having rule of law deficiencies.
Okay.
These are jurisdictions where they believe local prosecutors aren't adequately enforcing the law,
Yeah.
leading to a breakdown in public safety.
So the federal government's stepping in
Mm-hmm.
when local authorities are seen as failing to protect their communities?
That's right. They even suggest the possibility of bringing federal charges against individuals who escape accountability at the local level.
Okay.
And they go further, proposing potential legal action against local officials, including district attorneys who they believe are denying citizens their right to equal protection under the law.
Wow, that's a pretty strong statement.
Yeah.
They're essentially saying that the federal government should intervene when they see local officials failing to uphold the Constitution.
That's their position.
Okay.
They believe that the DOJ has a responsibility to ensure that the law is applied fairly and consistently across the country.
And what are some of the other tools they want to see the DOJ use in its fight against violent crime?
They call for policies that encourage more aggressive prosecution of violent crimes and the imposition of appropriate sentences.
Okay.
This includes support for the death penalty in applicable cases.
Yeah.
They argue that a tougher approach to sentencing is needed to deter crime and hold offenders accountable.
So it's a multi-pronged strategy.
Yes.
They're looking at everything from increasing federal involvement to changing sentencing guidelines
Right.
and supporting tougher penalties.
Exactly. It's a comprehensive approach that reflects their belief that the DOJ needs to take a more active and assertive role in combating violent crime.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, from reforming the FBI to tackling violent crime.
Right.
But the chapter doesn't stop there.
Yeah.
They also address organized crime and national security threats.
Uh-huh.
What's their take on those issues?
They call for a revitalization of tools for dealing with criminal organizations,
okay.
emphasizing the need for stronger enforcement of the RxCO Act, which targets racketeering activities.
Okay.
They also want to see a crackdown on interstate drug trafficking.
And border security is a big part of that, right?
Absolutely. They see a direct link between border security and the activities of criminal organizations, particularly drug cartels.
Yeah.
They argue that a more secure border is essential for preventing the flow of drugs and other illicit activities into the country.
And of course, the fentanyl crisis is front and center in this discussion.
They draw a direct line between a porous border and the influx of fentanyl,
Yeah.
highlighting the devastating impact this drug is having on communities across the country.
Mm-hmm.
They argue that the DOJ needs to work closely with other agencies, like the Department of Homeland Security, to address this crisis
Okay.
and stem the flow of fentanyl into the United States.
So a coordinated effort between multiple agencies to tackle this complex problem. And on the national security front, I understand they want to see a return to the China Initiative. Can you remind us what that is and why they see it as important?
The China Initiative was a program launched during the Trump administration that focused on countering economic espionage and intellectual property theft, allegedly perpetrated by the Chinese government.
Yeah.
The chapter argues that this program was effective in identifying and prosecuting individuals engaged in these activities and that it should be reinstated to protect American businesses
All right.
and national security interests.
So they're concerned about threats from foreign actors, particularly China, and they see the China Initiative as a key tool for addressing those threats.
Exactly. They believe that the DOJ needs to be more proactive in identifying and countering foreign influence operations, and that the China Initiative was a valuable tool for doing so.
It sounds like they're advocating for a pretty significant shift in how the DOJ prioritizes and addresses national security threats.
They definitely want to see a more assertive and focused approach,
Okay.
one that prioritizes protecting American interests from foreign adversaries. They argue that the DOJ has become too complacent in this area and that it needs to step up its efforts to counter the growing influence of countries like China and Iran.
Okay, so we've talked about reforming the FBI, tackling violent crime, and strengthening the DOJ's response to organized crime and national security threats. But there's one more key theme that runs through this chapter: defending the rule of law. Can you tell us more about what they mean by that?
This is where the chapter gets into some of its most fundamental critiques of the DOJ. They argue that the department has strayed from its commitment to fairness and impartiality,
Okay.
becoming a tool for partisan ends.
They're essentially saying that the DOJ has become politicized,
Yeah,
that it's no longer applying the law equally to everyone.
exactly. They argue that this undermines public trust in the justice system
Right.
and erodes the very foundation of a fair and just society.
And they call for a return to the department's core values, which they define as independence, impartiality, honesty, integrity, respect, and excellence. It's a pretty high bar.
It is, and they don't mince words about the extent of the problem.
Yeah.
They claim that the DOJ is operating with a two-tiered system of justice,
Okay.
where the rules are applied differently depending on your political beliefs.
So a sense that there's one set of rules for those who align with the current administration and another set of rules for everyone else.
That's the perception they're highlighting. They point to examples like the use of the FACE Act, which prohibits obstructing access to reproductive health clinics,
Okay.
to prosecute pro-life activists while attacks on pregnancy resource centers go unaddressed.
Right.
They argue that this is a clear example of the DOJ selectively enforcing the law to target specific groups.
So a double standard in how the law is being applied.
That's their argument. They believe that this perceived bias undermines the legitimacy of the entire justice system.
And how do they propose to fix this? What are some of their specific recommendations for restoring the DOJ's commitment to the rule of law?
They call for a number of significant changes.
Okay.
First, they want to see an immediate end to any policies, investigations, or cases they deem unlawful.
Okay.
This would involve a thorough review of existing practices
Yeah.
and a commitment to upholding the Constitution and existing laws.
So a clean sweep of anything they see as legally questionable or politically motivated.
Exactly. They also want to eliminate unnecessary consent decrees, which they argue are often used to impose burdensome regulations on state and local governments without proper justification.
So reducing federal overreach and giving more power back to the states.
That's one way to look at it.
Okay.
They also want to ensure that the DOJ's litigation decisions are aligned with the president's agenda and with the rule of law. They argue that the department should be a tool for advancing the administration's priorities, but that this must be done within the bounds of the law.
So a balance between advancing a political agenda and upholding the law.
Exactly. And this is where they bring up a particularly interesting legal point.
Okay.
They suggest that the next administration should consider pushing to overturn the Humphreys Executor v. United States ruling.
Okay, I have to admit, I'm not a legal expert. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah.
What is Humphrey's Executor and why is it relevant here?
Well, Humphreys Executor was a Supreme Court case that essentially established the concept of independent agencies.
Hmm.
These are agencies like the Federal Trade Commission or the Securities and Exchange Commission that are headed by individuals who can't be easily removed by the president.
Okay.
They have fixed terms of office
Mm-hmm.
and are designed to operate with a degree of independence from political influence.
So they're supposed to be less susceptible to political pressure
Right.
and more focused on carrying out their specific missions.
Exactly. But the chapter argues that this independence has gone too far.
Okay.
They believe that it undermines the president's authority to control the executive branch,
Mm-hmm.
and that it makes these agencies less accountable to the will of the people,
Yeah.
as expressed through their elected representatives.
So they see it as a challenge to the separation of powers, with these independent agencies operating outside the direct control of the president.
That's their argument.
Okay.
They believe that the president should have more authority to shape the direction of these agencies,
Yeah.
and that overturning Humphrey's executor would restore that authority.
That's a pretty radical proposition. It would fundamentally change the way these agencies operate and potentially have a ripple effect across the entire federal government.
It would be a major shift in the balance of power.
Yeah.
And it's just one example of the bold and far-reaching changes this chapter proposes for the Department of Justice.
It's clear that they have a very specific vision for how they want the DOJ to operate, and they've laid out a detailed roadmap for how to achieve that vision.
They haven't left anything to chance. They address everything from the structure and leadership of the FBI to the department's approach to immigration enforcement
Yeah.
and its role in protecting free speech.
It's a lot to take in.
It is.
And it certainly raises a lot of questions about the future of the DOJ and its relationship with the American people.
It does, and it's important to consider these proposals carefully,
Right.
to weigh the potential benefits and drawbacks, and to think about the kind of impact they would have on our society.
That's what we're here to do on the deep dive, to explore these complex issues, to provide context and insights, and to encourage thoughtful discussion, and we'll continue doing just that after a quick break.
Sounds good. Before the break, we were discussing the chapter's argument that the DOJ has strayed from its commitment to the rule of law.
Right.
They propose a number of ways to address this perceived problem. And one of the most interesting is their call to safeguard constitutional rights, particularly the right to free speech.
Yeah, you're right. That caught my attention, too. They even criticized the DOJ's position in the 303 Creative LLC v. Lennis case, a case that dealt with compelling speech based on personal beliefs. What was it about that case that concerned them?
Well, the chapter sees the 303 Creative case as an example of the government overstepping its bounds, trying to force individuals to express messages that go against their deeply held beliefs. They argue that the First Amendment protects the right to refuse to speak, just as it protects the right to speak freely.
So from their perspective, it's a matter of principle. The government shouldn't be in the business of dictating what people can and cannot say, especially when it comes to matters of conscience.
Exactly. They view this as a slippery slope that could lead to the erosion of free speech rights for everyone. They want to see a DOJ that vigorously defends the First Amendment and protects individuals from being compelled to express views they don't agree with.
That makes sense. They also call for a significant shift in focus for the Civil Rights Division, moving away from equity initiatives and towards a stricter enforcement of existing civil rights laws. What's the thinking behind that?
Well, they argue that the Civil Rights Division has strayed too far from its original purpose of combating discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, and sex. They believe that the focus on equity initiatives, which often involve using, race-based policies to achieve certain outcomes, is misguided and potentially discriminatory in itself.
So they're advocating for a return to a more traditional understanding of civil rights, focusing on equal treatment under the law, rather than trying to engineer specific social outcomes.
Exactly. They want to see a civil rights division that focuses on protecting individual rights and ensuring that everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed, regardless of their background. They believe that this is best achieved by enforcing existing laws that prohibit discrimination rather than pursuing policies that could lead to reverse discrimination or preferential treatment for certain groups.
It sounds like they're trying to draw a clear line between what they see as legitimate civil rights work and what they view as overreach or social engineering.
That's a fair assessment. And as part of this shift in focus, they propose a very specific change, reassigning responsibility for prosecuting election-related offenses from the Civil Rights Division to the Criminal Division.
That's an interesting move. What's the rationale behind that?
Well, they argue that election-related offenses, such as voter registration fraud and unlawful ballot handling, should be treated as serious crimes that warrant the attention of the Criminal Division. They believe that placing these offenses under the purview of the Civil Rights Division has led to a lack of attention and resources, potentially allowing these crimes to go unpunished.
So they're concerned that these offenses haven't been taken seriously enough and that moving them to the criminal division would send a stronger message about their importance.
That's right. They believe that this shift would ensure that these crimes are investigated and prosecuted more vigorously, ultimately contributing to a more fair and secure election process.
They also take aim at what they see as politically motivated investigations and prosecutions, often initiated at the behest of outside groups. Can you give us an example of what they're talking about?
Yeah, they cite the example of the National School Boards Association, the NSBA, sending a letter to the Biden administration in 2021, requesting federal intervention to address threats and violence directed at school board members. The chapter argues that this letter, which compared some parents' actions to domestic terrorism, was politically motivated, and that the DOJ's subsequent actions, including the creation of a task force to address the issue, were an overreaction that further politicized the department.
So they see this as a case of an outside group using its influence to push the DOJ to pursue an agenda that wasn't justified by the facts on the ground.
Exactly. They argue that the DOJ should be driven by evidence and the rule of law, not by political pressure or the demands of special interest groups.
This chapter goes into a lot of detail about how the DOJ should be structured and how its resources should be allocated. What stands out to you in those areas?
One key point is their emphasis on aligning resources with leadership priorities. They want to see more political appointees throughout the department, arguing that this would enhance accountability and ensure that the department's actions reflect the president's agenda.
So more control from the top, making sure everyone is on the same page and working towards the same goals.
That's the idea. They also want to end the practice of detailing DOJ personnel to other agencies, particularly congressional offices. They see this as a drain on resources and a potential source of conflicts of interest.
Interesting. So keeping the DOJ's focus internal, ensuring that its personnel are dedicated to the department's mission.
They even delve into hiring practices, calling for a review to ensure that selections are based on merit and impartiality, not political affiliations. Again, the theme here is depoliticizing the DOJ and making sure it's focused on its core responsibilities.
They also make a surprising point about DOJ grants. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, the chapter argues that DOJ grants are a powerful tool that can be used to advance a conservative agenda at the state and local level. They point to examples from both the Obama and Trump administrations to illustrate how grant conditions can be used to influence policy decisions.
So using the power of the purse to encourage states and localities to adopt policies that align with the administration's priorities.
Exactly. They argue that this is a legitimate use of federal funding and that it's a tool that should be more effectively utilized to promote conservative goals.
And they propose some specific changes to how the DOJ handles its grant programs, right?
Yes, they call for a comprehensive review of grant dispersals, scrutinizing how funds have been allocated in the past and identifying areas where they believe changes are needed. They also want to overhaul the grant application process to include more rigorous vetting of applicants, ensuring that organizations receiving funds align with the DOJ's priorities and that the money is being used effectively.
So more oversight, more accountability, and a clearer focus on using grants to advance a specific agenda.
That's right. They believe that grants can be a powerful tool for shaping policy and promoting change, and they want to make sure that the DOJ is using that tool to its full potential.
Immigration is another huge area of focus for them. What are some of their key proposals in that realm?
They argue that the DOJ needs to step up its role in enforcing immigration laws, working closely with other federal agencies like the Department of Homeland Security and the State Department. They see a lack of enforcement as a major problem that has contributed to a border crisis and a decline in public safety.
So a more muscular approach to immigration enforcement, with the DOJ taking a leading role.
They propose issuing guidance to U.S. attorneys emphasizing the importance of prosecuting immigration offenses. They also want to see the DOJ assist the Department of Homeland Security in obtaining information about criminal aliens, especially in sanctuary jurisdictions that limit cooperation with federal immigration authorities.
So a crackdown on sanctuary cities and a more aggressive pursuit of individuals who are in the country illegally, especially those who have committed crimes.
That's right. And they go even further, proposing a potentially radical step: withdrawing or overturning every immigration decision made by Attorney General Garland.
Wow, that's a bold move. What would be the impact of something like that?
It would essentially wipe the slate clean, allowing the next administration to start fresh and implement its own immigration policies without being bound by decisions made by the previous administration.
It would certainly signal a dramatic shift in direction.
Mm.
What are some of the other immigration-related proposals they highlight?
They call for the repromulgation of Trump-era immigration rules, many of which were reversed by the Biden administration. They also suggest challenging legal precedents like the Flores Settlement Agreement, which has placed limitations on the detention of migrant children.
So a return to a more restrictive approach to immigration, both in terms of policies and legal interpretations.
That's the direction they're advocating for. They believe that these changes are necessary to regain control of the border, deter illegal immigration, and protect national security.
They also emphasize the need to protect American workers.
Yes, they call for more vigorous enforcement of immigration laws within the employment context, cracking down on employers who hire undocumented workers. They argue that this is necessary to ensure a fair labor market and protect American jobs.
So making sure that businesses are following the law and that American workers aren't being disadvantaged by illegal immigration.
That's their goal. They also express concerns about fraud within the immigration court system and advocate for reforms to address those issues. They want to see a more efficient and fair system that upholds the rule of law while protecting the rights of individuals who are seeking asylum or other forms of legal status.
It sounds like they're advocating for a pretty comprehensive overhaul of the immigration system, addressing everything from border security to employment practices to the functioning of the courts.
It's a multifaceted approach that reflects their belief that immigration is a complex issue with far-reaching consequences. They argue that the current system is broken and that bold action is needed to fix it.
This chapter really covers a lot of ground, doesn't it? We've talked about everything from reforming the FBI to tackling violent crime to reshaping immigration policies. But even with all that, they still find time to address some additional areas of reform within the DOJ. What are some of those?
Well, they delve into the organizational structure of the DOJ, suggesting changes to improve efficiency and effectiveness. They propose consolidating certain functions, eliminating redundant offices, and streamlining the department's bureaucratic processes.
So making the DOJ leaner and more agile, cutting out unnecessary layers and reducing waste.
Exactly. They believe that a more efficient DOJ would be better equipped to carry out its core missions and serve the American people.
And they also touch on the importance of the Bureau of Justice Statistics and the National Institute of Justice, which are the research and data arms of the DOJ.
Yes, they emphasize the need to protect the integrity of these institutions and ensure that they're producing reliable and objective data. They argue that accurate data is essential for informed policymaking and for holding the DOJ accountable for its actions.
So making sure that the DOJ is using evidence-based practices and that its decisions are grounded in solid research.
That's right. They also want to make sure that the information produced by these agencies is accessible and understandable to the average American. They believe that transparency and public engagement are essential for building trust in the justice system.
So not just producing good data, but making sure that data is shared with the public in a way that's clear and meaningful.
Exactly. They believe that an informed public is better equipped to hold the DOJ accountable and to participate in the debate over criminal justice policies.
We've spent this deep dive really unpacking this chapter's vision for a dramatically different Department of Justice. It's a vision that's rooted in the belief that the DOJ has, lost its way, becoming too politicized and straying from its core mission of upholding the rule of law.
Yeah, and the chapter argues that this shift has eroded public trust in the institution. They suggest that restoring that trust requires a fundamental overhaul, realigning the DOJ with what they see as conservative principles and priorities.
They've laid out a very detailed roadmap for reform, tackling everything from the FBI's structure and investigative powers to the department's approach to violent crime, immigration, and even the use of grant funding. It's a bold agenda, And I'm curious, what do you think is the most significant takeaway from all of this?
I think what's most striking is the emphasis on accountability. They want to see a DOJ that's more responsive to the president's agenda, a department where political appointees play a greater role in shaping policies and priorities.
So, a DOJ that's more directly aligned with the will of the people, as expressed through their elected leader. But that raises some interesting questions, doesn't it? If you increase political control over the DOJ, doesn't that also increase the risk of politicization? How does the chapter address that concern?
Well, they argue that the DOJ is inherently a political institution, that it's impossible to separate it entirely from the political process. They believe that the best way to ensure accountability is to have a clear line of authority with the president at the top, setting the agenda and appointing officials who share their vision.
So they're essentially saying that transparency and accountability are more important than trying to maintain a facade of neutrality. They want a DOJ that's openly aligned with a particular set of values and priorities.
That's right. They believe that this approach would ultimately lead to a more effective and trustworthy DOJ, a department that's focused on carrying out the will of the people and upholding the rule of law as they interpret it.
But what about the potential for abuse? If you have a DOJ that's too closely aligned with a particular political party or ideology, couldn't that lead to the targeting of political opponents or the selective enforcement of laws?
That's certainly a valid concern, and it's a question that anyone considering these reforms would need to grapple with. The chapter doesn't explicitly address that specific concern, but their argument hinges on the belief that a DOJ that's more accountable to the president, and therefore to the electorate, would be less likely to engage in such abuses.
So the idea is that the checks and balances of the democratic process would prevent the DOJ from becoming a tool of political persecution.
That seems to be their assumption. They believe that a more transparent and accountable DOJ, operating under the direction of an elected president, would be subject to greater public scrutiny and would ultimately be more responsive to the needs and concerns of the American people.
That's a lot to unpack, and I think it highlights just how complex these issues are. Reforming the DOJ isn't just about changing policies or structures. It's about grappling with fundamental questions about the role of government, the balance of power, and the very nature of justice itself.
You're right. And this chapter, while offering a specific perspective on how the DOJ should be reformed, ultimately invites us to engage in a broader conversation about these questions. It challenges us to think critically about what we want from our justice system and how we can ensure that it serves the best interests of all Americans.
I think that's a great point to end on. This chapter has given us a lot to consider, and it certainly sparked some thought-provoking discussions. But as you said, this is just the beginning of the conversation. We encourage you to continue exploring these issues, to seek out diverse perspectives, and to engage in thoughtful dialogue about the future of the Department of Justice.
It's a conversation that's worth having. The DOJ plays a vital role in our society, and it's essential that we as citizens engage with the issues that shape its mission and its impact on our lives.
Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive. We hope this exploration has been informative and thought-provoking, and we encourage you to stay curious, keep learning, and keep asking the tough questions.